Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another edition, another episode of the Doctor's Lab with myself, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker, and our esteemed doctor in the right hand of the screen to me, Dr. Khalid Green. Assalamu alaikum, brother Khalid, Dr. Khalid.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A pleasure to be back and on the Doctor's Lab to do some lab work.
Yes, we're going to put in some work today, inshallah, and we're going to cover different angles. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're going to cover some different angles, and I think of a subject that is ever more important, looking at what we're facing today. And I want to place a context. And as you can see coming up on the screen, 21st Century Hijrah, dream or reality. And the reason we're speaking from the perspective of 21st century is because we need to look at the dynamics and the context in which we are discussing Hijrah from the societies that we are residing in at the moment, and the societies that we may intend to, or some may desire to travel to in that regard. And I'll hunker down a bit more, Khalid. We're looking at things on the news recently where we've got children identifying as animals and teachers supporting those children in America and in the UK identifying as animals and chastising those students who are criticizing and providing a counter narrative saying this is wrong. There's only two genders, male and female, and the discussions and them being called bigoted, them being marginalized for this. And so it comes to the point, we're not going to get into that as a discussion today, I appreciate that. But what we need to look at is, well, if you can't withstand or tolerate the degeneration or moral decay in whatever society that you're living in, where do you go to do Hijrah, if that's what you intend to do? And is there a Hijrah to those lands? And I'm not contradicting the hadith that there will always be Hijrah until Yawm al-Qiyamah, but we're talking about practical terms, practical context in which the question must arise, is it possible? And what are the practicalities, the advantages and the disadvantages? What do you say, Khalid?
So, Jazakallah khairan. So first and foremost, as we know, and we definitely have to keep some of the parameters of our discussion around the ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala implores us and mentions about those people making hijrah who failed to make hijrah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the state that they were taken in, the malaika took their souls in. And one of the statements Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, he says, fima kuntum qalu kunna mustad'afina fil ard qalu alam takun ardullahi wasi'a. So the malaika will ask those individuals, fima kuntum, where were you, as far as making hijrah and stuff like this, and you were dealing with oppression and struggle and these khilaf, these differences in morality and so forth. And they say, and then the malaika will reply, alam tukun ardullahi wasi'a, isn't Allah's earth spacious? So we know Allah's earth is spacious, but I think a lot of people, their image of hijrah is going to be to particular lands. Generally, a lot of people who even have this discourse are thinking of lands in the Arab Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, first and foremost, maybe the UAE and places like this, which are, places where you can live a very nice lifestyle if you, can, have those means, employment, whatever the case may be. So that command is there, and the earth is spacious, where there's a lot of broad alternatives, to consider, even though there are still limitations. Indonesia, to go there, and I think Malaysia, there's still a lot of conditions, and you still may not be able to get now a permanent residency permit or whatever, especially I think in Indonesia, they have some restrictions. But to start thinking about African lands, especially those of us who have African heritage, that some of those places may be more welcoming. I've thought about, I do want to get Ghanaian nationality, even though it's not a Muslim country, but I think you'll find a lot of, Islam is pretty strong there from what I hear, and the Dawah is very strong. And, just to have alternatives, because there's still a lot of values that we may share, even those non-Muslims there, and those values that might be shared, some conservative values where they're not going to tolerate gay marriage, at least anytime soon. And these kind of other things, which are assaults on our children. So now there's a lot of things to think about and unpack here.
Jazakallah khair for that response. Wa alaikum salam to brother Musa and Ammar as well. Yes, a very pertinent topic, I think, in these days that we're in. And the ayah that you referred to, Khalid, I understand that ayah is with regards to those in the condition that they cannot practice their religion in the societies that they are in. That censure, that warning, that threat is for those who cannot practice fully in the way that they need to, establishing the prayer, things like this. And we know from the ulama that in the lands that you and I are in America and the UK respectively, we are able to practice our religion. So therefore,
many things of religion, but yeah, go ahead.
Aspects of religion, yes. But the point now, I'm extending it beyond us in that we need to look at the trajectory that is there with our children, okay? And what we are seeing, I was watching a video today and there was a march. This was a podcast that was there, non-Muslims in the podcast discussing in shock, and they were providing the evidence. It's on YouTube. You had a gay choir in one thing, you had them all across on the screen singing a particular song, and you had a march of LGBTQ. And what was synonymous with the chorus of what they were both singing separately at different times is, we're queer, we're here, and we're coming for your children.
La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah.
And the choir was singing that as well. We are coming for your children. So now, when we look at legislation and we look at what's taking place, I've seen the books that are in the educational system in America. I've seen the similarities with what's taking place in the UK. And this ideology is being pushed. Now, again, I'm not here to talk about that at the moment. We need to unpack that at one point, and it's most probably going to get us cancelled.
I think it's going to be hard for us to divorce this from the conversation because it's such a core for driving this. But anyway.
No, what I mean though is that one day we're going to have to dedicate a doctor's lab to this. Then we will have to wait for a knock on the door, possibly, because of the things that need to be highlighted and it might happen over there and over here. So the point is now, are we able to withstand the onslaught, the ideological onslaught, the ilhab al-fikri that we spoke about, that Sheikh bin Baz spoke about, rahimahullah, in the 70s, I think it was, okay? Because they're targeting our children at this particular point now. And the only way may be to get them out of the lands that we're in so that they can have a moral upbringing. They can have an Islamic or more religious society that they are growing up in. And as you mentioned, Ghana, this is an interesting point, and I want the viewers to understand this. Yes, the dawah is strong in Ghana. My son-in-law is from there. I've got family there. But not only that, the other faith, predominant faith, Christianity, like in Nigeria and other African countries, they have that moral value that is the same, similar to the Muslims, so that you will not have to be exposed to what we are seeing in the West with this ideological slide into an abyss that many are unable to counter because it targets whoever counters it. So from the point of Hijrah, parents may be thinking about that. And that's a legitimate concern to have as it relates to our children. The practicalities can be altogether different. And what I'm pleased about, again, Khalid, that you mentioned, you moved away from the Middle East. And it's not that we're anti-Middle East. I've just come back from living 20 years there. You were there for many years. But the Hijrah, if anyone's considering Hijrah, there are many places to do the Hijrah. But the one point I will place here and hand it back over to you. The nation states that exist today, some will allow you to apply and obtain citizenship, others won't. So when you are moving to those lands, your niyyah has to be very clear, and you have to be very clear as to whether Hijrah is possible. So let's give an example. Saudi Arabia. Many gave the intention for Hijrah in a country that doesn't allow Hijrah, okay? Many others, like myself, went there knowing that we're not doing a hijrah, but we're going there on a visa, on an iqama, where we can't own property and land, and we're going to work and accrue the benefits, the religious and otherwise in that respect. However, the hijrah of the heart is something that all of us should be looking to make, no matter where we are. That's another level, that's a spiritual level. So
yes,
again, I'll stop at this point. Not all the countries where individuals may aspire to do hijrah allow hijrah. So can you do hijrah to a country that's telling you you're not welcome to do hijrah, but you're welcome to work here if you've got the qualifications and if you've got the skill sets, or you're coming to study?
So I think that raises a very important question, and it's been raised to the scholars about this too. And again, it goes back to one of the things you said, and also to that ayah, because in the end of the ayah, it mentions about the one who dies. And again, just for those who might not know hijrah, we're talking about migration, and we're talking about migration from a non-Muslim society or a sinful society to a Muslim society. So it mentions that the one who tries to make hijrah, tries to migrate, and he dies, that his reward still is with Allah. So one of the things we learn from this, and from also discussing with the ulama, is that that's not really ultimately upon you. It's important if you want to fulfill this great duty, and I think that's what I would say is a final, after all the intricacies and things that we're going to talk about, nuances in our discussion, is that ultimately your reward is going to be tied to your intention. If you have the intention and you're totally unable, I can't get the money. Maybe it's a single woman with 7 kids and she can't get married. She can't find a way to get over there. But she wants to live in a place where she can practice her deen better, and she dies in her land, lives to a ripe old age. Her reward is she still will get the reward of the muhajir because of her intention. Likewise, even with all these barriers, as you said, the nation states, it's such a different reality now. And actually, I have a very good book. I think it's 2 to 3 volumes. I couldn't find it because I have a few books here that talks about this from a more contemporary perspective in the different Darul Harb, Darul Islam, and other classifications, and the issue of that you need citizenship and all these and ikamas. It talks about this. There's a piece of research out of one of the Saudi universities, some years ago, in the past 10 years maybe. Right. So, and it's a few volumes, so it goes into some of these issues. But again, ultimately the reward, having that intention is ultimately the most important thing. Now, what I advise people when they are kind of thinking about hijrah and immigration is to look at the reality of the situation of the country you're going to. So you may or may not, because still Allah can make you successful. You may say, I want to live in Saudi. I want to live and die there, and I want my family to grow up there. And Allah may still make a way for you. You may have different jobs. You may still, even with all the changes in the iqama system and all the differences and so forth, you still may be able to do it. And that's why I would never discourage someone, but I always encourage them to tie your camel, do your research. As you were saying, do your research, look at places where it's going to be more practical, and the people who have the more sacrifice, for example, a huge family, and not a lot of income, and it's difficult. I say kind of prepare yourself, because you have to know that because it's such a greatly rewarded act of worship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the reward is great and the struggle will be great too. Maybe sickness, maybe death, maybe this, maybe, you run into all kinds of things. And we've been there. I lived in Yemen. I've lived in Saudi Arabia. I've seen people who died there, who were just workers. And I've seen brothers and sisters who lost children. Their children died at after childbirth, and, and so forth, and they made their sacrifice for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they receive reward. And since I have the microphone real quick, I just want to read a couple of points. And this is what you and I guess I'll skip some of these things, but I'll go to a conversation you and I had. Okay. And so we already know kind of the Salafi position. And let me see, where are you? So I have exactly you mentioned in here, and I have your funnel here talking about the different states. Let's see. Baker responds to this claim stating, Had it been the case that Salafis are dormant, waiting to enact, okay, this is actually a little bit off, but anyhow, I'll find it and we'll get into some of the meat of some of the discourse you and I had about the issues of the changing perspectives of Hijrah after we lived in the Muslim lands, after we lived in Yemen, after we lived in Saudi, and you've been in the UAE and lived there. You know, what you saw, some of the great obstacles and the challenges even for your children and the challenges for staying there. There's a lot of things to consider. And that's one of the things I would say to people: don't have glossy-eyed and think you're going to paradise on earth. But there's no doubt being in a Muslim land in general, because of the prayer, because of the many, many, many things, the environment, there's so much good. And I'll turn it back over.
No, absolutely. And Khalid, take time, look for that. I think that's brilliant what you've said there, because there are all of those aspects to consider. And if we bring some of our personal experiences in there, when going to the Muslim land, you do tend to go there with an idealism.
Yes.
And sometimes that can be brought to an abrupt ending when you see the treatment that is meted out. Now, I, on the whole, didn't experience that. Allah knows best why. My 20 years there, alhamdulillah, overwhelmingly positive. But it wasn't until my children were older that they started sharing with me some of the challenges they were having in schools, interacting in society. Now, our lens was, let's move to a Muslim land where the children and we will not be castigated because of our religion. And we weren't, alhamdulillah. And one of the beautiful things about being in Muslim lands, and others who may have gone to different countries in Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, wherever, is when you go to a masjid, you don't have to be cautious on the whole of the masjid that you're going to. You could go to any masajid to establish your 5 daily salah, the timings and everything there. Now, contrast that with me being back in the UK, and I decided not to move back into London. And I've got to navigate which mosque is this, what mosque is that affiliation, what time their prayers are. If I go to this mosque and say Ameen, so that you don't have in the Muslim lands. You also have in the Muslim lands, up until recently in some, the adhan is heard. That adhan connects. And even though sometimes you may become familiar with it because of the years that have gone by, that connects with your soul. And you only realize how much you've missed that once you become used to it and return to the lands of your origin, the UK, America, or whatever Western society, African country, Asian country you may return to that doesn't have Islam prevalent there. So there should be, as you said, Khalid, a focus, removing the rose-tinted spectacles, the glasses, to go there with a realism. But also what I would add is this: you have to take something to offer to that society. Many have gone to Hijrah, converts, thinking that they will be welcomed because they are converts. No, those lands where you can do Hijrah are not like Medina. They're not going to see you coming and that you're strengthening their society unless you have skills and knowledge to contribute to that society. And we see the problems with immigration in the US. We see the problems with immigration in the UK today. And if we've been looking from a practical point of view, yes, immigration should be allowed. This is how countries were built. This is how they advanced and everything like that. But if we know that some people are coming into our community, let's be frank, and they're not bringing anything, they're just coming to take because they like the composite structure of our communities, our society, the environment, we are going to have a negative perspective on them. So when we see societies where we want to live or we aspire to live, especially in the Middle East, having their Isation drives, Saudiization, Emiratization, whatever those drives are, and we frown upon them, there are some questionable things regarding why we cannot acquire citizenship in their country if we've been there for 10, 15, 20 years and we have the qualifications and our children are born there. There are questions around that, but there is an understanding that opening the floodgates to those all and sundry to come in, and they're bringing nothing to the table. The Muhajirun emigrated to Medina. Look at what they brought. Look at what they brought, and those others who emigrated to Medina. So if we want a model to look at with regards to Hijrah, we need to look at the best generation, and we need to look at what they bought.
Yeah, absolutely. We're totally on the same page that and this is what I try to emphasize, because you have a lot of situations. You may have single sisters saying, hey, you know, I remember a particular sister contacted me, and she mentioned, she says, you know, what do you think? I'm going to go to Saudi Arabia because because it's wajib to make hijrah, right? And I was just like, you know, and she had her, I think at the time she had her son, you know, so she was a single mother. I was like, no, not. I said, there's a lot more to that. You know, as long as you can practice your deen, the kibar ulama, especially in Saudi. Now, there's other views, no doubt, like the Yemeni mashayikh, and then throughout history, you know, these discussions have been going on, you know, since the time of the Salaf about the obligation of hijrah. But I tend to adhere to the view that as long as you can practice your Islam, that it's recommended for you to make hijrah, not an obligation. So meaning that you're not just living in sin, but obviously you need to be producing something. So anyhow, going back to what I was saying, is that the practicality, you know, some people feeling that push and that need without anything to offer. So I'm just going to show up in Saudi Arabia. I've got a passport. I don't have any money. Now what? You know, and I've done that before. I did that in the UAE when I left Yemen. And within 2 to 3 days, I had nothing. I was about to be homeless in the UAE because it was so expensive and such a drastic change from Yemen and my expectations. So it's very important to have a good, for people to prepare for such a great duty. And here's one of the quotes. It's a little bit backtracking, but this is one of the things you and I discussed. And you said, I remember when I was new on the deen as a Salafi, there was a lot of talk about hijrah to the land of the Muslims to study, to work, and stuff like that. I think with the generation that has been here, that now knows and has actualized their deen in a more comprehensive way, theoretical learning and then abstract, enhances their insight by seeing the deen, being more experienced and mature in the deen, gives them new perspectives. I think that has happened with many who came out and lived in the Middle East. The actualizing has not only showed us to live a more Islamic life, but that we were being a more religious than thou beforehand, being overzealous. So this is one of our conversations that we had. And, you know, there's so many things to unpack, but I think, again, people have to have sometimes some realistic expectations. And also, as you said, to bring something to the table. So that's why I advise now when I hear people, you know, and it's usually a lot of maybe they're reverts, they're new, or they're people who may have an attachment. They may be Somali, so they can go to Somalia, they can go to Hargeisa, they can go to Mogadishu, or they're, you know, Pakistani or something like this. They have some options, whether they want to use that or not, where because of what we see on the ground now, there's a new challenge in such a system that's supposed to be so open to the values, where it may make it to such an extent to where one day it may be an obligation, because no, you can't practice if you can't raise your children Islamically, once it becomes to that level, and it's very rapidly going in that direction, because if you can't impart some important religious values, and that's considered discrimination, that, hey, we don't want to participate. No, you have to talk about, you know, men and changing, and you have to give your hijabi daughter who's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 the choice. If she wants to be a little boy now, she can do it, and she should not wear hijab. And, you know, it's rapidly going in that direction. In other European states, we already see, you know, France, what has happened, you know, probably in the past 15 years, that's, you know, and Belgium and some of those other ones who've already banned hijab and niqab in certain spaces. So every country is going to have a different ruling, you know, according to the level that they can practice their Islam. Some of those countries, it may be an obligation for France, and that's going to be for Ahlan, the people of knowledge, to look at that. But, you know, every place is different. But again, preparing yourself, having something to offer is very, very important. It's very important. And then there was a question about, somebody said Haytham Haddad, and I don't know much about it. I've heard the name. I think he's some group, part of some group or something like this. I'm not really sure. Haytham Haddad in the UK. from
Yeah, from Al Muntada, we know him well. Yes, yes.
Okay. So talking against a mass Hijra oriented mentality. Well, he's somebody who made Hijra to the UK. Okay. So again, we got to kind of look at some things there, unpack that, but that's another story. And talking about one reason being our sheer number and mass Muslims. Okay. Again, the duty is not necessarily going to change based on the mass numbers. If it becomes an obligation for you to go, you've got to go and practice your deen wherever you're going to find a safe place to practice. That's first. And again, we know the masses are probably not, they're not even thinking like that, but there's more and more numbers that are thinking because they're seeing what's happening to their children. Like we already know in Sweden, for example, a lot of families children are being taken away from the parents. A lot of the Syrians are finding that they're getting their children taken away by the state. And then who's raising them? Jim and David, who are married, and all kind of things. They're losing their deen, they're losing everything. And they say, should I have taken that boat trip here to Europe? Now you think about it, after a travesty to your deen and your family has happened. So there's a lot of things to unpack there about how we prioritize. That's going to be upon every individual to determine. We're not talking about the millions in every single individual, but you've got to think about what are you doing if you stay in a country like that, and the risk to you and your family, where it becomes an assault on your religion and an onslaught to your values and morality. And that is the acceptance. It's not that it's just happening, but it is now pushed on you. You have to do it. Islamic schools have to talk about same-sex marriage and changing their things and sharing the bathrooms between the boys and girls. Then you've got to begin to think, well, what are you going to do as an individual? And what are you doing if you do stay in there? Aside from all those challenges, are you a person who the ulama mentioned in the past about, okay, if you are in the aspect of dawah, you're doing something positive. I feel myself, after having studied something about Islam, that I can't just totally divorce myself. So in one form or another, I have to be doing some sort of dawah. And that's who I am anyway. So I can't totally divorce that would kill my soul, So the point is if you do remain in a place where there's the sin has become the khubth, the evil and the wickedness has become overwhelming, the obligation becomes even greater for you to leave that. And if you are choosing to stay, or for a time, you need to be doing things that are advancing Islam, a greater sacrifice. So I'll turn that over to you, because I know I got a little bit on it.
No, it's good that you addressing Musa's questions. I think it's very important that those were addressed. Assalamu alaikum, reactionary. Good to see you there. And yes, the comments from your reactionaries just placed up there is exactly the point that we were speaking about earlier on, that Western Muslims are not in actuality welcomed other than temporary work assignments. And we're seeing that more. And sticking to that point, just spoke to a student of knowledge, or communicated recently with a student of knowledge you and I both know very well, Talib al-Ilm Khalid Green, mashallah, tabarakallah. And we've been talking about things and the situation in Saudi Arabia. And we're seeing amongst a lot of other colleagues who've been contacting me, and this is something that I saw when I was there. And as you know, while I worked as director and was running institutions and everything, one of the things I saw with the climate is that when they wanted to affect your income, to reduce it, as he said to me, back to 23 years ago. We're looking at salaries and packages of 23 years ago. Once the society does that, they know that they're either going to cause an exodus of expats who've been there, or they know that the ones who are going to remain are those who have come out there for Hijrah, or the ones who are going to stay there at any cost. So there's an exploitation that takes place psychologically, I believe, and the expats know that's being done to them. But they know that they have to compromise in order to not return to the lands where they once resided, or where their lands of origin in that respect. Speaking back to Musa's point in the question that Haytham Haddad has highlighted, that he's mentioned there, it's a correct statement. When we're looking at the populations in India, for example, the Muslims in India are still larger by far than the population of Pakistan that broke off in Pakistan and Bangladesh, respectively. When we look in the Western context, we've got enough Muslims in Europe to take over some of the smaller countries. And I don't mean take over, we're going to go and overrun them. if you took the populations and placed them into Norway, Denmark, societies like this, the Muslim population collectively in Europe will outnumber those particular environments. And this is where we see the emergence of the fiqh of minorities, where there's some discussion around that. But I think it's an important development about the fiqh of minorities, because for the first time in our living memory since Islam and the fall of the Caliphate, we're seeing Muslims living in such numbers outside of Muslim populated countries that there would be and continues to be unique developments in which there hasn't been any precedent before. So this, yes, we have qiyas, and we have to look at those things, look at the ulama, and look, as we've spoken before, to those of knowledge within our societies, those who've studied, yourself, Sheikh Tahir White and the like, Ali Davis, Mufti Munir in the UK as well, to look at these and say, right, okay, how do we navigate in view of the challenges that we're having there? So there's the fiqh of minorities, and more recently, there's been discussion of the fiqh of citizenship, okay, which is a more proactive and dominant identity than the fiqh of minorities. The fiqh of minorities was a sort of reactive, sort of passive context in which we face these challenges. What are we going to do? Fiqh of citizenship is saying now, for the generations that exist, we are here, we have rights. We are going to say what those rights are, and we're going to shape some of those rights because we are citizens. We are US citizens. We are British citizens. We're Norwegian. We're whatever. So that fiqh of citizenship is something, I think, that enshrouds or encapsulates what you're saying, that if we are here and we can practice our deen, we have to be doing something proactively, even if it's dawah through our actions, through our behavior. Like we saw of the Salaf, when they moved around and traversed the earth, they didn't always give dawah with the lisan. And it wasn't definitely not just restricted to the sword, as we have the Orientalists and those who Islamophobes highlighted, but it was through mu'amalat, through business, through interaction, through usloob, through behavior. So everyone who's in the West and doesn't feel they have the compulsion, as the ayat says, to make hijrah, have a duty to play. So we shouldn't have Muslims in prison because of fraud and crime and committing criminal acts in that instance. We shouldn't have some of the things that have become very public about negative aspects of Muslim behavior and interaction in that regard there. These are things that we need to make sure we're giving dawah away from. We need to be giving dawah through our characters in that regard there. So I've brought these aspects here, Khalid, because this is all talking about, as you're saying, if we are to reside here, what we must be doing, the epitome of which is dawah, and that has various levels. And we must remember this as well, and I'll pass it back to you. If residing here in the West, we have a duty to enjoin good and forbid evil at 3 levels. We've spoken about those levels before. With your hand, if you're able to stop it with your hand. And in the context we're living in today, where we don't have that in the West. And we're not talking about and even leaning towards that terroristic ideology, which is a batil one and miscontextualized one. The second one is to hate it with your tongue, to speak out with your tongue. That's in writing, in inshallah doing what we're doing today in that instance there. And if you're unable to do that because if in speaking out it's going to cause harm to you, severe irreparable harm to you, your family, your community in that instance, then the third aspect is to hate it in your heart, which is the weakest of iman. Unfortunately, some Muslims today, and we can't see what's in people's hearts, but by their amal, by their actions, they're actually embracing and showing a love of some of the masiyah and the degeneration that we're seeing in society today. So you can only think or imagine what their heart must be feeling if they're proclaiming with their tongues what's in their heart about some of the moral decay that we're seeing in society today, and acceptance of some of this moral decay. So the necessity to hate in the heart as the minimum aspect of faith is something that all of us in the Western society must be doing if we are to justify our existence in this point at this point in time here. And I'll hand back to you.
No. This is gonna really be a result of seeking knowledge. So if you're just in the West, which the masses are just living, okay, I just want to get my job at Microsoft. I was a professional in Pakistan. I was a professional in India. And I got this nice job from Bill Gates. And I live a 6-figure income. And I know a lot of people like this, a lot in my city. Okay. There's a lot of people, and I know some of them that are very practicing, like Dio Bundys and this and that and the other. So they're practicing, mashallah. They use that time. They're in the masjid practically 5 daily salats because they can work remotely and so forth. But the masses are there to struggle for that freedom. They may dislike it in their heart, some of them, but I think still there's a lot of people, it's just like, well, it's sort of like, not my problem. Let my children have their freedom. And then they learn the hard way. Why did Fatima leave Islam? Why does she have a girlfriend? Why, they stress later, but they did nothing to educate themselves, educate their children about Islam. So, if you're going to stay in a place where sin and things which totally contradict Islamic values is so prevalent, that you definitely everyone needs to be doing some thought of it. And they need to be raising their bar of their understanding. That's what's going to instill that dislike, because there's a lot of our youth who don't even know now, because they spend 8 hours in school and another 6, 7, 8 on their devices. And then their parents maybe take them to the masjid, maybe are totally divorced from the masjid. What do you think the result is? You're going to have mass scale exodus from Islam, mass scale exodus unintentionally from Islam. Just, I'm a Muslim by culture. I'm from Palestine. I'm from Syria. I'm from Lebanon. I'm from Pakistan. I'm Muslim. That's it. That's all they know about Islam. We have a crisis going on right now in many of the places, as we've talked about in our other sittings and podcasts, about the crisis of identity for our youth, their Islamic youth. So if people aren't doing the duty, I think that's going to, in reality, it's going to be the hal of the masses. They will develop a new kind of practice, and with a lot of compromise as far as what's left of their practice of Islam. As far as masses, there will be masjids. The masajid are not going to be abandoned, and there's not going to be, inshallah ta'ala, millions and millions of people leaving America to go to the Muslim lands. No, but you see who's going to maintain those masajid if you're losing 3 of your 4 children or half of your children. What's going to be the next couple of generations? Because if there isn't, especially knowledge to be able to, and to instill that, to know the moral values of Islam, what's right and what's wrong, that, hey, this is unacceptable in Islam. We cannot, you will never, there's impossible for an imam to marry another man, or for him to conduct that ceremony between 2 sisters. It's illegitimate, min alif ila the last harf. Okay. There's no, it's impossible. So, but the new generations, and that's why we have these movements, LGBT, we had the queer iftar in Canada, and we have a lot of these movements that are saying we're queer and we're Muslim. We're going to have a queer Muslim parade, queer Muslim iftar, queer Muslim Eid. They're going to have every kind of queerness, and because they are trying to bring a new narrative. They've accepted that assimilation, and their gatekeepers, those progressives, those progressive extremists, and others who have, there's some who, through intelligent discourse, they are leaving the deen. And then there are those who, just because it feels good, they like that, like the commoners who are progressive, it just feels good. They don't want those chains of the sunnah. They don't want the chains of, they want a general understanding of the Quran. The Quran means peace. Islam means this. They've redefined the terms. They've redefined the narrative. And that's why it's easy for them to accept these new values, because they don't even really know what Islamic values are. Their values are so broad. It is just, and I talk a lot about that in my thesis, how they've redefined the narrative, and this is how they can say and try to justify that a man can marry a man, and we should be in the trenches helping them. So yes, we need that in our Islamic schools. So you'll have those people, and people who go to that level, there really shouldn't be much doubt that some of them are pure hypocrites. Not even, we can't hesitate about takfir of some of them. They have totally legitimized what Allah has prohibited. You cannot say, if Allah says this is haram and this is from the shaitan, you cannot say, no, it's really from the angels. It's really a godly attribute. La takdib al-Quran. You have now, queer iftar, don't laugh, reactionary. I did a video. I have a video and it's called Queer Iftar. Why? And I have the flyer of it. And I told people, contact these people and tell them not to do it and tell them to repent. You know, I encourage them not to in a harsh way, but this is legitimate. We laugh, but that's how extreme it is. What is next year going to hold? Next year's going to be, no, let's have gay Muslim marriage day. Let's have gay Muslim transformation day, where you have 2 children and they can be 7 years old and they should marry and they should change their sexes. So the boy was the girl and the girl was the boy, and we should have a dog officiate the marriage. This is what's coming. Don't think it's funny. It's true. It's right there. We're right. We're about to fall into that. So
I think
this is the danger of not making the hijrah. That's one of the things I want to, you know, why we should never lighten that load. If you're going to at least reside in these countries, in Western countries, and I'm not saying that I'm rushing to leave myself, but I do want options for the future. I want a Muslim homeland as well, but at least not living in where you're going to be entrenched in that, you know. Alhamdulillah, we homeschool, and that's min fadlillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, you know, also have the option of being in the countryside where totally you're almost away from that, and in a conservative area too. So you've got to look where it's going to be best to practice your deen as a part of and parcel with that hijrah. And as you said, as the last point, the fiqh minority, of course, it is being developed out of necessity much more. How do we deal with banking? How do we deal with, you know, all these things that we may not have been faced with before? And in certain times, in certain places, when a Muslim land was overtaken, like in Spain and those places, Andalusia and things like this, you find some of those fatwa that some of those scholars of that time, you know, and I'm interested in looking at some of those things to see how, you know, to learn for how they dealt with being Muslim minorities. So this fiqh is developing quite a bit, you know, and the necessity for it is absolutely, it's imperative, because we have masses here and the masses aren't getting the door. You know, Saudi is not going to open the doors and say, come on, you know, unless you have those qualifications to come as a worker, because of Saudiization and their own issues and problems that they have to deal with. If they keep unemployed Saudis, what is the end result with that? They have to employ their own people. So they've turned inward in that nationalism. But in some countries, it's worse. Look at what Turkey with the Syrians and many other places. You know, it's not about just this Muslim brotherhood. They begin to, that breaks down when there's a lot of political pressure and, you know, the lack of resources. You know, okay, the Syrians are taking too many of our resources. Oh, they're starting to start business. This is making Turks jealous. This is making some other people feel alienated. It's their own country. These are the same problems we would have here in America, for example, with Mexico, Mexicans and others coming across the border illegally. You know, those same type of scenarios and pressures and feelings, even in the Muslim land. So there's so much complexity and so many things that we have to deal with on a variety of levels.
Dealing with the last point you mentioned, just to reinforce what you're saying, I had to do the viva of 2 master's degree students quite recently, and when reading the theses of one of them in particular about Turkey and the challenges there, to speak to the point that you're talking about, after those devastating earthquakes that shook them, there was one case that really struck me, and I asked a student when I was questioning her about the viva. There was a Syrian lady who was in the rubble, okay, and she'd been there for days. Old lady, okay, in her 70s, I think it was, and she obviously survived. And she said she saw the Turkish rescue people going past all of the time, but she didn't speak. And she was asked why not. She said, because I only know Arabic, and I feared that if I spoke in Arabic, they would have left me. This is the fear. This is how acute that thing is with regards to speaking to the point about immigration, the challenges. But I want to come back now to the point of fiqh of minorities. And I want to first, I think reactionary doing lol, if we didn't laugh, we'd cry. That's one thing. I know you know that. But the second point that he mentioned about zakat, which is very, very important. Today, the Muslims are the most generous in giving in the UK and in the West. And as reactionaries pointing out, lack of access to our zakat means our poor Muslims turn to crime and fill prisons. This doesn't need to be the case, because a lot of the Muslims who have the wealth are usually second, third generation in that instance. You know, and I know, as converts, when we came to the deen, we'd left particular earnings that we were getting from before, which were not permissible, even if we were working legally. I worked in the legal field. I was training to become a lawyer. But because of the riba that I used to have to win for my clients, that left me feeling very, very uncomfortable. And you couldn't say, I cannot get riba for you. I'm going to leave that. So I had to make changes in that regard. Alhamdulillah, Allah guided me in the way to where my career continued to grow in a different field. The point is, now speaking to Musa's point, to bolt onto what reactionary said just here, and if Hassan can bring that one up, where he's talking about being a good British Muslim and building infrastructures where we are in the West. So here, is it possible to be an outstanding British Muslim if you always have Hijrah in the back of your mind? Very good question. No, I don't think it is possible, Musa, in actuality, because you've always got one eye in looking over in the corner, one foot out of the door. So can Western Muslims build lasting structures if our minds are always elsewhere? Another very good question. What I think in this instance, and I'm not contradicting what I've just said there, I'm saying yes, knowing that it will take time for us to move and do a hijrah according to the hijrah that is dictated or highlighted in the Quran and from the Sunnah. Knowing that that's distant and possibly unlikely for many, to then focus and build infrastructures that are there. And Muslims have done that in America, and they've done it in the UK, and they've done it across Europe. To do that, understanding and acknowledging that not everyone is going to be able to do that hijrah is imperative. It's a priority. It's a fard, I think, is it Ayn Kifaya? I'm not sure which one. I'm not a scholar in the Eastern perspective to speak about that. We'd have to see what the scholars say. But I would say, as scholars, and I call you one with your PhD, and we're considered that in the West from a Western perspective, that this is an imperative step and an ongoing action that needs to be taken, Khalid. That yes, while we know that there's that desire, that intention, maybe to have that hijrah of the heart, our hearts may have already gone where we want to be, where we want to hear the adhan. We may never hear the adhan in our time here in the UK, and that's okay. That's not what we're expecting. But to have infrastructures that are there, that are accommodating, that are catering for us and our children, not just masajid. Unless the masajid can be institutions like we saw the prophetic masjid and masajid that were there, that had everything, schools attached to them, colleges attached to them. What we saw in Timbuktu, educationally, financially. If the masajid is going to have these associated organizations, which a number of them do, then yes, the masajid should be the focal and central point. It should be anyway. But it shouldn't just be like we're seeing with some of our co-religionists, just come, pray, we're Salafi masjid, that's all you need to do. And you see dysfunctionality the moment you leave from the masajid. If it's not in the masajid, it's the masajid themselves. We've seen that in America, we've seen that in the UK, we've seen that in the community that I come from. All of them being content with just saying, I've got my thobe, I'm wearing my niqab, I'm black abaya, we're Salafi, we're reading Kitab al-Tawheed, we're doing the books of Tawheed. But in the socio-economic, the socio-cultural, the socio-political involvement and interaction, shaping your immediate environment, contributing and participating in society. Why? Not because you love the society, but you want to make sure you've navigated a space that is safe for the coming subsequent generations and for your own soul and your own self, so you can answer to Allah that I gave dawah to this society by establishing these institutions. Without that taking place, we are in a very precarious situation. And as you said, then we need to look at where is there for hijrah if we're not even contemplating making these establishments.
Yeah. I think, again, that goes maybe not goes without saying, but yeah, that's what we absolutely need to be building these institutions and so forth. I disagree with you in that those ideas have to contradict. Someone can be, I believe, firmly preparing to make hijrah and contributing all the way up until they leave, or being an imam and being a community leader and building institutions. And they don't contradict each other. They don't have to. You could be looking at, hey, I'm trying to save my family, but while I'm here, let's still work. I'm a Muslim lawyer and I can help the litigation for getting this masjid property and getting it advanced, and we can help build this counseling center and this and that and the other. So one of the things I would also say is we are so far behind. And as you mentioned, this zakat going abroad. So yeah, and I'm even guilty myself a lot of times, and that for various reasons. But that we do need to develop these institutions. We need to, and the thing I would say is an indictment of our communities and ourselves is that we're doing very little. So yeah, we have some institutions. I don't hardly know of very few Muslim counselors that are practicing Muslims and practicing on the Sunnah. Okay. Very few psychologists. Yes, we have doctors around and we have this and that and the other, but how many are really serving the community? And how many, when we have these issues, as we talked about maybe a couple of episodes in the past about, we having these phone calls about people ready to commit suicide and stuff, and having resources. We hardly have the Muslim resources. And I'll give you an example. The prison, which I'm about to leave, is where I'm employed. And the there's an organization called Church on Wheels or something. They provide all the inmates with these massive meals, and you see their volunteers coming in now after COVID. They're coming in like several times a week. So many programs. You can see the favoritism because, of course, the administration and the chaplain, he leads the prayer, and it was a big deal for me to get a little baby Eid, going through all these hoops and stuff like this for the brothers. But the point is they have massive support. I was just talking to a brother yesterday who's been incarcerated for 16 to 18 years now, at least 18 years, I think 18, 19 years, good friend of mine. And he was telling me, he says, here in this, and he's not even in this state, he's calling me for another state. He says, here we have no Muslim volunteers. And I know the Muslims in this thing, they have money. We have no support for the Muslims that are incarcerated. We have no volunteers. We have no activity. We have no visits. We have nothing. So Muslims in general in the West are so far behind, not just because, and the UK probably differs from America. America, I think, is even more behind, even though it's massive and so forth. But the UK, just the history is different, with the influx of various migrants who are part of the British Empire and, all the other historical things going on there. But we have we just have a lack of institution. And it seems like now there's a great push in a lot of these communities because everyone's losing their youth. And especially, as I had a fascinating conversation last night here with a brother, especially certain youth. Of course, we have our youth as reverts, especially African-American, and the Somali, East African youth, whereas it's unfortunate, but so fascinating on the other hand, how a lot of these kids are not so disenfranchised. It's not like they're all suffering. A lot of these kids, they come from some of the middle-class families and so forth, but culturally there's something else going on with the, whether it's country Western music, whether it's Bengali traditional music, all of it's haram. But when you're pumping in music and culture and so forth, the gangsterism and the kill one another like it's nothing, that's advertised in the music, that's pumped up in the culture, it's on the movie, every movie's about it. Shoot them up, kill the people who look like you. Because the same thing with the Hispanics. I was talking at work and they were saying, Mexicans, we kill only if it's other Mexicans. This is what they told me at work. And it wasn't the gangsters. This was actually people in administrative positions. They were saying, as Latinos, we kill other Latinos. And I said, well, that definitely echoes in my community too, as African Americans. So we have this, there's a cultural issue. There's a hardcore tarbiyah issue of not latching onto our children. And how much are we going to be able to do that by staying in the West? If you give your children those 8 hours in the schools and stuff like that, when are you going to teach them those values and keep them away from what everybody else is listening and watching? You have to be 100% on that parenting and inculcating certain values so they don't, it's glorification. If you were to listen, you and I, we came up in the KRS generation. So I'm sure, even without asking you, I know you like KRS. I can tell from who you are. Okay. I already know we came up from positive. Those were our favorite. I like the NWA. I like the gangster rap. I love that stuff. But the way that stuff, if you're pumping that stuff in, and Beyonce is the hero for your daughters and all that stuff, they're just so bombarded. How do you save these hijabi girls? How do you save these young Muslim boys from the who want to be gangsters? They didn't even have to. We see these Somali kids, they're filling the prisons now. They're killing each other. A Muslim Somali sister just assassinated another Muslim. I think she was Somali. Wait, maybe she was Ethiopian or Somali, and she assassinated a Somali girl whose mother had already lost her son, I think, a year or two ago. Okay, through violence, and I think it might have stemmed from that. She assassinated. She came strapped with her hijab and blah blah blah. So something is gone wrong, and it wasn't because they're super poor and super underprivileged. We have a crisis of values and education and priorities, and it's very hard to be 100%. As a parent, you do have to move out of those environments. You have to give your Somali children, put them with the people who are studying technology, because if they stay around their peers, everybody is getting influenced in the masajid, the youngsters. We just buried the brother who I mentioned. Okay, his first son, when I got this job, we buried him. And then I got this job here in New Mexico. His second youngest son, 17, was just killed 2 to 3 weeks ago. So the mother has buried her 2 sons without getting everybody's business out there. I mean, we got things we got to do. And so this is another dilemma of staying in the West, that we're faced with so many things. Even if you come from a religious family, even if you try, there has to be so much more as far as that micro managing of the environment. And a last quick point, the brother was mentioning about some book. I guess it's called The Falsehood of a Teenager, something, the fallacy of teenager, or something like this, meaning the concept that this was introduced after World War II, according to the researcher. And before, you were either a child, a kind of a growing adult, and then you were a young man or woman. But when you get this new classification, you begin to say, hey, he's a teenager. He can go out with his friends. We shouldn't be so strict on her. She's going to make these mistakes. Oh, she has a boyfriend on her text message, and she's doing this, and she's doing a little minor strip show in the back of the house while we're sleeping. I mean, she's a teenager. So once we began to accept these things for our Muslim youth, and just our youth in general, this goes for the non-Muslim in our communities as well. I mean, talking about African American, Afro-Caribbean, and stuff like this, as well as everyone else. When you begin to accept that leeway, and you begin to give them more leeway, that's destructive. Instead of getting them some, the brother was saying, giving them some excellent skills, introducing them to coding, taking them with you to the conference at 13. So by the time they're 15, they're on the concept of starting a business. So tarbiyah is like, he opened my eyes. We had a fascinating conversation, and hopefully we're going to continue today, and I'm going to put it on the YouTube. But subhanAllah, we have
Abdurrahim and I, that example you give Abdurrahim Green and I in our podcast, Piece of Cake, he bought that last year, that the concept of the construct of teenagehood is a relatively new phenomena, and it's there It was created for the very reasons that you're saying there, to let these young adults off the hook to do all the stuff that they're doing there. But what I want to say in this instance now, talking to that, Hijrah, dream or reality, we do also have the challenge that those who are going abroad for Hijrah, there is that risk. That you mentioned the conversation I had, and you quoted me from my PhD and the work we're doing, that while we're living in the West, many of us have that abstract understanding of the deen and idealism. When we go to the land of the Muslims, predominantly Muslim societies, we are then able to actualize. What do we mean actualize? Contextualize. We're living it. We're seeing how the rest of the society is living. We're in a majority Muslim society now. So we realize that the practice that we had in the West was somewhat miscontextualized. And many brothers I know, when I was living in Saudi and living in Dubai, we had this discussion that, don't you feel we're doing less here? Don't you feel that where our dawah was stronger when we were there, our deen was stronger when we were in the West? So, and we have that this discussion, and I discussed with them and said, you may feel that way because it's as though we've arrived now and we're actualizing, and the challenges aren't as much. And some say, shouldn't we be in that state of mind in the UK, here in the land that we're in? No, because then we would stand out and it would be abnormal in that particular context. So there's that risk there, because when we look at some of our children grow up with that comfort in those societies. We've seen that from the natives of those societies as well, and they come out and their deen is weaker in its visibility, and in some instances in their adherence to the deen. So when they then interface and interact with those who have not had that experience and are still in the West, they see this strength, this focus, this zeal, this challenging of the status quo, and they admire that in us because we've come from the West. But we tend to lose it, or it dilutes when we go into those Muslim societies. So that's a reality that anyone going to a Muslim land for Hijrah, let's say work visa, whatever, will have to become accustomed to and understand what's actually taking place. And before I hand back to you, and I know we're drawing to a conclusion, I want to look what Musa was saying concerning, should there be infrastructure or framework in which there's a development or education and a movement towards assisting those groups, not the mass migration that we've spoken about already, that is an impossibility in this particular age, but to prepare individuals and like families move, for example, or groups of people, because Musa was saying in the comments there that at the moment Hijrah has been pretty much an individualistic endeavor. And that's very true, unless of course it's an internal Hijrah. I'm going to get a bit cheeky now, where you're told to make Hijrah to a particular city, or like we saw with the Ansar Allah cult, or Siraj Wahad's son, not Siraj Wahad, I hasten to add, but his son making a Hijrah out somewhere remote and starting a cult and everything like that. No, we're
about
not
2 hours from here. It's 2 hours from where I am right now.
MashaAllah. I'm glad you're not telling me that you're right in the heart of it, because I would worry for you.
I mean, a part of his community. No.
So in that instance there is that consideration that once you've arrived in those lands, predominantly Muslim, and you actualize and contextualize, you feel, is it a dilution of your deen? I won't say necessarily it is, but you are now in lockstep with the rest of society, and it's a comfortable place to be, that you hear the adhan. You don't have to be looking at your time or have the muadhin on your watch or your phone or anything like that. That does take place, but then there's the risk that when you look at your children's upbringing and their lackadaisical understanding of the deen, that they grow up weaker than you, less practicing than you, and even aspiring to go to the West and to eschew aspects of their deen.
Right. Yeah, I think those are always going to be challenges. And your religiosity, again, people also have to understand, if they make the Hijrah or they go to live in the Muslim lands for a while or what have you, it's always going to be an obligation, fard al-ain, meaning every individual has to make hijrah from their sins. Because you can go, I've known people who've become rappers in Riyadh, who were not rappers in America. They were practicing and this and that and the other. They became rappers and famous because they were from America and they had some skills. Or in Jeddah, sorry. And then in other things like this, we know countless stories. So again, it's never going to be where it's relaxed to where you still don't have to raise your children. You still don't have to be responsible for yourself and practice your deen. It's going to make it easier in many aspects. And as you said, there was a void because we used to go out in the street and give dawah and stuff, especially in our early times of Islam. And then you come to a place, you're in Jeddah, you're in Riyadh, you're in Medina, you're in what have you, and maybe you don't have activity in dawah. But at least for me personally, my first 2 years in Sardiya, alhamdulillah, I was very active with a good beloved Sheikh Abu Abdurrahman from Philistine, Palestinian brother, who he and we used to travel a lot and do dawah in the clinics. He worked officially for the dawah to Irshad, the dawah center that's, paid for by the government and stuff like this. And so we would go to the hospitals and the clinics and talk to the non-Muslim workers from Sri Lanka, or especially a lot of Filipinos and stuff like this about Islam, and people would accept their shahada. But we used to do a lot of lectures. So those first 2 years I was very active and had that, that was good training and zeal. But then when I moved to Medina, that began to change quite a bit, and I focused more on seeking knowledge, and I didn't have that, Abu Abdurrahman was in Hayal, and so you do lose that. And then you get older, and then coming back to the West, and you don't have that same zeal, unfortunately, to be out in the street giving pamphlets and stuff, which we should be doing, which we should be active. And it's critical. And I'm going to give you a side point that I know you can identify with. Recently, actually, I was coming here, I decided, the past couple of weeks, so I decided to put on Malcolm's speech, The Ballad or the Bullet. And then there was also another speech I listened to, and it was fascinating. And it was fascinating to see, rahmatullah alayhi, rahmatan wasiya, his experience, but also his activity, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him to be such a source, or again, that was the nation. So he was building the nation, but those types of efforts, that street dawah, that's the asl. And that's before social media, to move it from a few hundred to thousands from his street dawah, getting out there, and Allah favored him with the rhetoric and stuff like this. It just gave me a lot of food for thought, and a lot of things I was just, pointing out and his mistakes as well, as well as in various things. But the point is, there does need to be that vigilance when we are back in the societies, that we still need to be a part, have some role in, going back to that raw essence of dawah and in the masajid, but outside on the street. We need to be giving that message to non-Muslims. And that's the thing, we become so insular, not just as Salafis. I know you guys have Hyde Park and these things in London, which is a tradition there in and of itself, but we definitely need that all around the West. We need to be active in portraying Islam and not hiding our Islam and becoming comfortable, because there's a lot of people, they're just comfortable. When I talk to some people here, some of the Muslims from different backgrounds, when we had some gatherings during Ramadan, and I said, how are the Muslims there? Oh, no, we don't have any Muslims there. So what are you doing there? Oh, I work at the college and this and that and the other. And I was just ridiculing, just talking about things which are openly sinful, which he didn't even really think were sinful, because of his lack of knowledge about Islam and his acceptance of being just Muslim to come to, it's like a cultural thing. So we have so many of our Muslim brothers and sisters who are just culturally kind of Muslim, and, dawah or just hardly even practicing is of very little consequence to them. And that's the grave danger in the West. Yes, it happens in the East, but in the fact that you have the Adhan and you have those other institutions, it's in your face. You might as well go pray, because everything's shut down in Saudi Arabia. Mostly that's been the history. Right. So even the people who are secular or whatever are not really practicing, they at least had to wait in their car outside of Danube, outside of the marketplace, and just really embarrass themselves by refusing to pray when they could pray in the masjid. They could pray at the masjid that's right behind them. but they just decide, hey, let's wait, and we'll wait till the store opens and then we'll go shopping, or we'll continue shopping because they lock the doors, and we'll shop inside as men with the women. Come on.
Right.
But,
I'm gonna interject at that point and there's so much, alhamdulillah. Brother Musa, my email address will be given to you by Brother Hassan, Reactionary, the sisters, brothers who've joined in. I'm going to conclude at this point because Maghrib's coming in, and you're going to see me do this now as we're fasting. I'm just going to nibble a bit, Bismillah.
Now,
I think that what we've discussed today, is a huge subject, and it's one that we can talk about in a lot of detail. Khalid and I will discuss in the next few days whether we should do a part 2 or we look at this from another aspect. There was a lot discussed about what we should be doing within this society, and we have talked about these aspects before, but I think revisiting them,
of course,
is something we should look at, looking at the acceleration of the degenerative ideologies that are affecting, if not just us, our children. So I would say on this we will conclude. I think it's been a really insightful discussion, engaging as always, Brother Khalid, Dr. Khalid, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks and the audience in 2 weeks. So Jazakumullah khaira. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallahu feekum.